Hello everyone, I'm Ashwin Luke. I'm a third year medical student and today I'll be covering the osteology of the upper limb. So the bones that I'll be covering in this lecture will be the bones of the arm, bones of the forearm, and bones of the hand. In the bones of the arm, I'll be covering the humerus. In the bones of the forearm, I'll be covering the radius and ulna, and the bones of the hand, I'll be covering the carpal bones. Note that I won't be covering the scapula and clavicle in this lecture. So before I begin this tutorial slash lecture, I just want to put a disclaimer that I do not cover everything regarding the bones of the upper limb. The reason for that is I just find that the best way to learn anatomy is to study it yourself on the textbook. However, the purpose for this lecture is just to cover some key points regarding the bones and to act as a kickstarter so that when you do engage with it in your textbooks, you already have some idea of what's going on with the bones. And the reason I wanted to cover osteology is because WITS doesn't really teach it very well or doesn't teach it at all. And knowing your osteology really helps you when you study attachment of the muscles. So knowing all this information, we can now begin with the lecture. So when you deal with osteology, you see some pretty funky names. So just to make it more relatable, I put some terminology of what they mean, at least for me, what they mean, just to relate it to common day objects, to make it more relatable and maybe easier to memorize. So trochlea is like a pulley, capitulum is like the head, a tuber, anything with tuber, tuberosity or tubercle is like a swelling, a sulcus is like a groove, and a fossa, when you think of a bowl or ditch, it's just the circular indentation into something. So now that we've covered some basic terminology, we can now start dealing with the actual bones. So the first bone that we'll be dealing with is the humerus. On the left side, you can see an anterior view of the humerus. On the right side, a posterior view. We shall be starting with the anterior view of the humerus, starting from superior to inferior. So from the top down to the bottom. So the first big features that you notice is the head of the humerus, which is basically what forms the ball and socket joint of the arm. Moving on, we'll be seeing the greater and lesser tubercle. The significance of these tubercles are that they are the attachments of the rotator cuff muscles, which is your sits, which is your supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, and your subscapularis. If you look a little bit more inferiorly, you see that they form a sulcus known as the intertubercular sulcus. So let's break that down. Inter means in between, tubercular means referring to the tubercles, and a sulcus is a groove. So these two tubercles kind of form this groove in the center between them. And you can see that the two crests, the crest of the greater tubercle and the crest of the lesser tubercle, form borders around them. The significance of the intertubercular sulcus and these two lips around on both sides of it are that the attachment of three major muscles, namely pec major, which is attached to the lateral lip, teres major, which is attached to the medial lip, and latissimus dorsi, which is attached to the intertubercular sulcus itself. Moving more inferiorly, we see the deltoid tuberosity, and the muscle that attaches to the deltoid tuberosity is the deltoid. Quite simple. Moving more inferiorly, we see two fossas, the radial fossa on your left side and the coronoid fossa on the right side. These are two fossas, like we said. Think of a bowl. It's a circular indentation into the bones, and the two structures that go into those indentations are, for the radial fossa, it will be the radial bone. For the coronoid fossa, it will be the ulnar bone, and the feature of the ulnar bone that will go in there is the coronoid process. Moving more inferiorly, we see two very distinct features known as the capitulum and the trochlea. The capitulum is a very rounded structure, so think about like it's sort of like a head-like structure, and the trochlea, as we mentioned before, is that pulley type structure. So you see like two roundish shapes with a groove in between, and to either side of the capitulum trochlea we see these pointed structures that are going outwards, and those are the epicondyle. So we have a medial epicondyle, which is on the same side as the head of the humerus, and the lateral epicondyle. So that's really covering the main structures of the humerus. Just to point out, if I can point out any nerves or neurovascular structures related to these bony structures, is that if you look superiorly, just under the tubercles, you see something called the surgical neck. Surgical neck's relevance is that there is a nerve that is quite closely placed to the surgical neck called the axillary nerve. So that's important when you're studying the anatomy of the bones and stuff. When there's fractures, certain structures will be damaged. So knowing which nerves and vessels are located near these structures will help you find out which structures are damaged. And if we look inferiorly, the medial epicondyle is related to the ulnar nerve. So if there's damage near the medial epicondyle, you know there'll be ulnar nerve damage. Now moving to the posterior view of the humerus, there's only one really big anatomical feature, or maybe there's two anatomical features that I really want to point out, and that is the radial groove, which is located really in the center of the posterior view of the humerus. The radial groove significance is that it contains the radial nerve. So damage to this groove will lead to radial nerve palsy, and radial nerve palsy basically means the effects that happen when your radial nerve is damaged. And a big effect when your radial nerve is damaged is your wrist will drop, and that's known as wrist drop. The radial groove also helps you indicate where two heads of the triceps brachii attach. So below the radial groove, one head of the triceps brachii will attach, and above another will attach. And lastly, we'll look at the olecranon fossa, which is going to, as we stated before, whenever there's a fossa, the thing before kind of relates to what goes inside the fossa. So inside the olecranon fossa, we will find the olecranon. And this covers everything that I find significant for the humerus, and yes. So now we move on to the radius and the ulna. So I'll be looking more at the radius and ulna in supination, in the anterior view. That will be the image on the left side. So if you look at the radius and the ulna, they're basically both inverses of each other. So if you look at the superior aspect of the radius bone, you can see that the head is quite circular in shape, and it's smaller in comparison to the top of the ulna, or the superior aspect of the ulna. And as it goes lower, it becomes larger, while the ulna becomes smaller. And if you look at the inferior aspect of the ulna, it's quite rounded, similar to the superior aspect of the radius. And if you look at the inferior aspect of the radius, it's quite large, looking similar to the superior aspect of the ulna. So first, let's have a look at the radius. So the radius, as we've stated, in the superior aspect has this very circular shape, known as the head of the radius. It has a tuberosity known as the radial tuberosity. The significance of the radial tuberosity is that the biceps brachii muscle attaches there. Then we move inferiorly, not many features of the radius, and just at the inferior aspect on the lateral side, you can see something known as the styloid process. So it's just a process that is on the lateral side, and as you look on the ulna, it also has a styloid process, which is just the sticking out of the bone. Now moving on to the ulna, we see the olecranon, and if you can remember on the previous slide, we had the olecranon fossa of the humerus. So the olecranon will go inside that fossa, and this all forms the elbow joint. And another significance of the olecranon is that the triceps brachii muscle is attaching there. We see something known as the trochlear notch. So if you could give a guess, you would assume that the trochlea goes into the notch, and you would be correct. The coronoid process, remember again, in the humerus we have the coronoid fossa, so that coronoid process will be going into that fossa. And another significance of the coronoid process is that the coracobrachialis is attaching to this coronoid process. You can see that this ulna also has a tuberosity similar to the radius, and the muscle that is attaching to this tuberosity would be your brachialis. Moving inferiorly, again, not many features, and then it has a stylo process similar to the radius. Just another feature that I'd like to point out is this interosseous membrane. So let's break that down. Inter, like we said, is in between, osseous referring to bone, and membrane referring to a membrane. So the interosseous membrane is the membrane between the two bones. The significance of this is that it divides the neurovasculature of the forearm into the anterior and posterior interosseous neurovasculature. So you may just keep an eye out for that. When you see the neurovascular name like the anterior interosseous artery or posterior interosseous artery, just remember that it's the artery related to this membrane. So these are the key features that I wanted to point out in the bones of the forearm. So the last section of bones that I'll be covering are the carpal bones. The carpal bones have significance because they are likely to be tested in a spot test, and I suggest you find an acronym that you can remember to help remember these bones, as it will make it much easier to remember. So let's start with the anterior palmar view of the bones. So we see that there's a bone called the scaphoid bone, which is right next to the radius. And the scaphoid and lunate bones are in contact with the radius, and they form the radiocarpal joint. Note that no carpal bones are actually interacting with the ulna. Next to the lunate bone is the triquetrum or triquetral bone, and then the pisiform bone. Moving on to the next set of bones, we have our trapezium bone, our trapezoid bone, our capitate bone, and our hamate bone. The capitate bone is the largest bone out of all the carpal bones, and I believe the pisiform is the smallest bone, and that will help you remember these bones. So on the lateral aspect, we have our scaphoid and our trapezium bone, and those are related to the thumb and the radius. Now looking at our dorsal view of the carpal bones, we can see that if you look at the fifth metacarpal bone and look upwards, you can see the pisiform bone again, which is the small bone. And really that's all there is to these carpal bones. You just have to memorize the names and keep a note of the relation to other bones. So like the scaphoid and the lunate are related to the radius. The pisiform is a smaller bone, the capitate is a larger bone. These are some of the key facts that you will need to know about the carpal bone. And with that, I conclude this lecture on the bones of the upper limb. I hope it has been helpful, and I've tried to cover a few of the important things that I think you need to know about these bones. However, I've not covered everything. I suggest you look in your textbook and study these bones in your netters or whatever textbook you're using to get a full knowledge of what you need to know, and also obviously whatever's been taught in lectures regarding the subject matter should be studied thoroughly and be applied. And I wish you good luck dealing with these topics, and good luck for any assessments that will involve these topics. Thank you.